you so much for joining us today for our webinar. Our topic today is going to be cyber insurance part 2. What are the potential costs of cyber risk? In case you missed part 1, you can also find that on our TMLT hub. We're pleased today to be joined by John Southrey again for this topic. He has extensive knowledge as in such a valuable resource. So John, we're really happy that you're able to be with us today to cover this topic, particularly during these times that we're in. Before we jump in, as I mentioned, John Southrey will be our speaker. We will have host, myself, Cassie Turner, and Kathy Bryant also joining us today. And then our disclaimer here, just take a peek at this. This is not a legal source. This is just educational material for you all to take a look at. And as you can see on your screen, there is a download pod to the bottom left. You can download the presentation slides there. And there is also a Q&A pod where questions can be posted. And as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded. So before we jump in today, I think that Kathy, you have a polling question for us before we get into the presentation.
I do. Our first polling question is, do you know what your practice's direct and indirect costs would be in the event of a significant cyber attack or cyber incident? That was a quick response. And we have 27% who say they do not know, and 73% who say they do not know and do not know. So that's not really that unusual. We hear anecdotally after practices have cyber incidents that many of the costs associated with that incident were not expected, were larger than they expected, and in some cases not covered by insurance. So John, let's take a look at the cost of cyber risk.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Let's talk a little bit about a little preface here. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly is impacting our lives in numerous ways, and cyber attackers are taking advantage of this novel coronavirus. We're seeing a lot of ransomware and phishing emails being designed to look like reputable information from trusted sources. So physician practices should definitely exercise more caution when clicking on links, opening email attachments, downloading files, and installing new programs. And for businesses such as medical practices that rely upon the unimpeded functionality of electronic data processing equipment and operations, it's really all about contingency planning and disaster recovery. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in this topic. I think during this, as we go through the progression of this slide presentation, think about what possibly could happen to your practice, what is the worst possible time for a loss to occur, and understand that what's most important is not necessarily knowing the answers to all the questions, but in knowing the correct questions to ask. So one of the big questions is, if you don't know your cyber risks, you're extraordinarily vulnerable. And apparently the majority do not, based on the polling question, and the financial cost of a data breach can be staggering. This is a quote from Mary Chaput, Chief Financial Officer for Clearwater Compliance. Well, we have found in our experience, having had reported almost 800 plus incidents by our policyholders since we added cyber liability in December of 2011, is healthcare entities often underestimate the probability, the prevalence, and the severity of cyber threats. The actual cost for remediation can be significantly higher than what was anticipated or expected, which is what Kathy basically said at the very beginning of this. Cyber insurance is the primary funding mechanism for paying the direct and indirect costs of a cyber-related loss, and we're going to delineate those costs in just a few slides. In 2019, healthcare providers continued to be the most targeted organizations for cybersecurity breaches, with nearly 4 out of 5 breaches involving this industry. The dramatic rise in successful attacks by both criminal and nation-state-backed hackers illustrates how attractive and vulnerable healthcare is to exploitation. And in part, that's due to a lack of investment in cybersecurity and lack of workforce training. For example, we had a claim reported by a rural hospital where protected health information was breached, and it involved over 800,000 records. It stimulated a class action lawsuit by a Washington, D.C. law firm who's representing 332,000 of the class members. Originally, the hospital thought it only affected 3,600 patients, but after they hired an IT forensics firm to do an investigation as to the causation of the breach, they determined that no, it was almost over 800,000 members, the entire patient population history that they had in a database, and it resulted in having 2 notifications that had to go out. The allegations extended beyond just an invasion of the privacy rights of the claimants and the defendant's inadequate safeguarding of class member private information, but also encompassed patient safety concerns associated with the breach. The notification costs alone were in excess of $735,000. This claim is still pending. So some of the patient safety allegations were the patients had to find alternative medical care and treatment. They had to delay, reschedule, or forego medical care. And they had to undergo medical care without providers having access to complete medical history and records. All 3 of those could lead to malpractice claims, in addition to not only also privacy actions because of the breach. Now, the inconvenience that the patients experienced with buying credit monitoring and identity theft protection, canceling and reissuing credit card and debit cards, placing freezes and alerts with a credit reporting company, closing or modifying other financial accounts, paying late fees and declining payment fees, and reviewing and having to monitor bank and credit reports. It's this burden that's placed upon patients that causes them to file claims, to go to an attorney and seek a class action status. Unfortunately, this is a consequence of a data breach, or consequences of a data breach. Now, what are some of the probable direct and indirect costs from a cyber event? The direct costs can include legal fees to hire a privacy law attorney, the IT forensics and data restoration fees. IT forensics is very expensive. Notifications and credit monitoring, which is really the main cost. Public relations and media releases. Call center support, to hire a call center to help you answer patient questions. Regulatory fines and penalties, which is the great unknown. We'll talk about that later. Third-party liability and damages. An example of that is the class action lawsuit I just talked about. And the indirect costs, or the soft costs that are often underappreciated, include business interruption, the loss of income and extra expenses and special expenses, and diminished goodwill or reputational harm. Patients, new patients, and existing patients may not come back to your practice because they don't trust your data security as a result of a data breach that had to be reported. In fact, let me back up for just a moment here. If the breach involves over 500 records, you have to report it to the OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, the enforcement arm of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and you have to have it published in the 2 most prominent media outlets in your area. That's how, and besides that, to the patients as well. So the breach response costs, about 40 to 60% of the total cost of a cyber claim come from the breach response costs, which includes the elements of legal fees, $5,000, $50,000, or it could be higher, call center fees, IT forensics. We've had several physicians who have exhausted their underlying $100,000 limit that TMLT attaches to all of its medical professional liability policies for cyber liability because the forensics costs exceeded $100,000 alone. Credit monitoring, customer notifications, the notifications. For example, the Anthem breach that resulted in 79 million records being hacked, an historic breach. You take $1 a record, that's $79 million alone. And then public relations, hiring a PR firm to mitigate the reputational damage. The 3 most common reasons for a breach are negligence, mostly on the part of the employees that you have, your working force, that negligently click on a malicious link or an email that is a phishing email, ransomware attacks, and just the physical theft of paper or electronic records. So let's take a insider look at the insurance policy. And the big question is, what is the business interruption coverage for a loss of digital assets? Digital assets are your data and your computer software programs. For a cyber attack that damages your data or computer programs, causing a business interruption. So the next couple slides are going to talk about business interruption. Now, for healthcare practices, the Office of Civil Rights has noted that healthcare practices are particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks, for example, from ransomware attacks, because patient health and safety may be impacted. So the tolerance that a practice has for system downtime is quite low, and they have a high availability requirement to access their electronic protected health information and billing records. The coverage insuring agreement or coverage agreement that covers the loss of digital assets is the network asset protection. It's part of TMLT's cyber insurance policy. It pays the expenses to restore data that is damaged, lost, erased, or corrupted due to a covered cause of loss. And that's a key term because it means the accidental damage or destruction of electronic media or administrative or operational mistakes in the handling of electronic data or computer crime and computer attacks, which is what we're seeing a lot more today. And the business interruption coverage is included for resulting loss of income and interruption or extra expenses that you incur to mitigate or to avoid the interruption and special expenses that we'll talk about in just a few slides. So here's a graphical depiction of what can happen in a business interruption claim, where you may be at a certain revenue level, and then as a result, there's a hack. Let's say a ransomware attack, your data is encrypted, you don't have a local backup, and you haven't stored it in the cloud, so there's no duplicate, and now you can't operate for a while, and your income drops. You finally, hopefully, restore your data or part of your data, and then you start to go back into business, and it's going to take a while to get to your pre-loss level. The components of that are the loss of net income, the fixed operating expenses, for example, your payroll that continues. You want to keep your employees hired, plus the extra expenses or extraordinary expenses that you incur and special expenses. All of those components lead to the total interruption loss. There are actually three forms of business interruption in our cyber insurance policies. Two of them are in the embedded or the primary coverage that we give to everybody under our medical professional liability policies. And one of them is only available through our buyout program, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The first one is brand guard. Coverage for reputational harm has a period of indemnity or period for how long it pays for 6 months after a 2-week waiting period. And this is for business continuity as a result of adverse media reports, and we'll have a slide on that as well. The network asset protection is the primary one that's triggered, and I just talked about that. It's paid after an 8-hour waiting period, so the first day is not going to be covered, let's say, for an 8-hour day, but thereafter up to 4 months or 120 consecutive days, and during that period to try to recover to the pre-loss level, an additional 30 consecutive days. And then there's a dependent business interruption sublimit. This is for dependency upon a cloud service provider or IT vendor that is hacked, and as a result, you can't access your data, protected health information or billing information, and that's paid after a 12-hour waiting period up to 4 months, 120 days, plus 30. So in summary, the network asset protection business interruption extra expense pays the loss of income, interruption expenses, and special expenses as a direct result of a total or partial interruption, the degradation in service, or failure of the computer system from a covered cause of loss. Such incidents include hacking attacks, the voluntary shutdown to mitigate the financial impact of a hacking attack, regulatory shutdown to comply with a regulatory order, administrative or programming errors, or accidental damage or destruction. Let me give you an example of that programming error in a claim that involved a healthcare provider, a large medical group. They were investigated after a programming error within their computer system allowed patient information of approximately 10,000 patients to become publicly visible on the internet. Their cyber coverage made sure the patient notification services, the IT forensics, and legal expenses were paid. Now, that programming error may have been a fault of a business associate as well, and there may be a claim against the business associate for errors and omissions in that programming mistake that if it was related to them. Interruption expenses or extra expenses go beyond just your fixed operating expenses like payroll, rent, and insurance premiums, which is a fixed operating expense as well, and often include the cost to restore, recreate, or recover data from electronic backups or written records. Additional expenses can include like temporarily renting data processing equipment, replacing patient services, paying overtime to staff. Now, I mentioned that the dependent business income sublimit blanket provider coverage, or dependent contingent business interruption is what it's also known as, is only available in TMLT's higher limits buy-up cyber liability program, which is an excess program to provide limits of $1 million up to $3 million, potentially higher, because 100,000 may be insufficient, and in many cases it is today with some of the breaches that we're seeing. Protect you from an unplanned outage, interruption, failure, or degradation of an outsourced service provider's computer system, such as your cloud service provider, that you're dependent upon if that provider was contracted to provide IT services. So if that IT vendor is hacked and that you're solely dependent upon their network or their system for the recovery of your data, then you may be impacted as well. Brand guard, which I mentioned earlier, is business continuity coverage for a brand loss. That's resulting from a notification of an adverse media report. Remember I mentioned that if it's over 500 patient records that are breached, and you have to report that to the two most prominent media outlets, that adverse media can result in a loss of revenue. So it would pay your net profit that could be reasonably projected immediately prior to the notification or publication of an adverse media report, and also include the net profit and income derived from substitute methods, facilities, or personnel used to maintain your revenues and for fixed operating expenses, such as payroll, a very big expense in any organization, to the extent such operating expenses must continue. Special expenses are a category that is of necessary expenses that you incur as a result of a covered cause of loss to prevent or preserve or minimize further damage to digital assets, including the cost for specialist consultants or forensic experts, because you as the insured has a duty to mitigate its loss, and this is one of the examples of hiring other people to help you do that. Preserve critical evidence of any criminal or malicious wrongdoing, purchase replacement computer licenses damaged or destroyed, or notify affected individuals of an interruption, degradation, or failure of an insured computer system. An insured computer system is your system that you own, lease, or operate, as well as an outsourced service provider system that is storing or hosting your data. The privacy regulatory defense and penalty coverage is the great unknown, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation. Because when the OCR gets involved and sends an investigation letter to you because you've had to report the breach, you don't know how long it might take for them to make a final decision or final disposition. It could be years. And they may assess a regulatory fine or penalty. In the Anthem breach I mentioned, the one that was historic, the HIPAA, under the HIPAA law and the OCR, applying that law, assessed a penalty of up to $16 million, which I believe is the highest monetary penalty that had been imposed at that time. And it may be a compensatory monetary award to a third party as a result of a security breach or privacy breach, including private regulatory proceedings or investigations of potential violations of federal, state, or local privacy statutes. The attorney generals in the various states have the ability to also assess their own state fines and penalties as well. And as this bullet point mentions, it under HIPAA, the HITECH Act, the Texas Medical Privacy Act, and now the international laws, when we're dealing with patients that come from overseas, in Europe, the EU's GDPR can result in also fines and penalties as a result of a security breach or privacy breach. And that's one of the coverages that is provided under a cyber liability policy. So TMLT provides coverage for data breaches and privacy liability actions, which protects your practice from major expenses, lawsuits, business interruptions, and regulatory fines and penalties. And I might as well insert in there ransom demands. Like, for example, we had a small medical practice experience a network breach caused by an email phishing scheme. All the patient files held within the practice's servers were immediately encrypted by malware, and the perpetrator threatened to delete all the files until a ransom was paid out. The ransom, IT forensic costs, and legal expenses were covered by the practice's cyber liability insurance policy. Now, we provide $100,000 for cyber liability coverage to all of our policyholders under TMLT and our subsidiaries or affiliates. But that is not sufficient in many cases involving large data breaches where you have a lot of records. And that's where the buy-up policy is very important to have the excess coverage. When you have a loss that's several hundred thousands of dollars, it's very difficult for a practice to fund that if they don't have the cyber insurance in place for that exposure. I believe this is the last slide right here, reducing your cyber risk. We always want to give you some risk management tips. You cannot secure your data if you do not know where it is. Complete a risk assessment. A security risk assessment is mandatory under HIPAA. It's not optional. Develop a risk management mitigation plan. Identify all your business associates, know how secure they are, and have them sign a business associate agreement. Have written HIPAA policies and procedures. Make sure that they're up to date. Educate your workforce. New hires, ongoing and security awareness training is key to that. Cybersecurity information technology partners, when you partner with them, you want to make sure that they have the proper cybersecurity posture as well with their business practices and with their staff. And if you have any confusion or questions about this, contact TMLT Consulting Services, which Kathy Bryant and Cassie Turner are part of, about your cyber risk management, and they can assist you. That is the last slide. Kathy, do we have any questions in the chat?
We're going to open it up to questions now. I would just remind you, you can submit questions through the Q&A pod here on the screen. It looks like we have a couple of questions. Before we get to the questions, John, there was just one thing I wanted to clarify. On one of the slides, you said that if a practice had a breach that involved more than 500 records, it was reportable to the OCR.
Yes.
In fact, all breaches, even of a single record, are reportable to the OCR. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone was clear that any breach has to be reported to the OCR. The timing of the reporting is different based on the number of records.
So to clarify that, what I should have said, or what should have been mentioned, is that if it's over 500 records, you have to report it within 60 days, correct? Right?
Correct.
If it's under 500 records, then you have to report it within 60 days of the end of the calendar year. Is that true?
That is correct, John.
Okay. Good comment.
So the first question is, I work for a telemedicine company as a contractor, and they're asking if they need to purchase cyber insurance.
Well, that's a good question. If you're an independent agent or contractor of a practice, then if the practice has cyber liability coverage, a lot of the cyber liability policies today will include as an insured independent agents or contractors doing work on behalf of or under the direction or supervision of the practice. So you may be automatically included as an insured, but you need to ask the question, do they have cyber liability coverage? And who is an insured under that policy? The best protection, or the optimal answer to that, is to have your own cyber liability coverage as the insured, the primary insured.
Great. Thanks, John. There's also a question about downloading the slides. You need to click on the actual document name, and then the download file button will become active. I don't see any more questions at this time. I would just remind you that you will be receiving an email with a link to the recorded webinar, as well as an opportunity for you to sign up for the next webinar, the release of medical records, a review of hot topics, which is May 26th. Any last comments, John or Cassie?
Well, the last comment I want to make is one of the great reasons for having cyber liability coverage is the coverage for the privacy exposure, the privacy law exposure. We're also having business interruption coverage, system coverage for system failure, cyber crimes such as ransomware and social engineering attacks, and media liability, multimedia liability, ongoing, online and offline, reputational loss.
Sounds great. Thank you all again for joining today, and we will be back with a new webinar next month.
Thank you.